and I had not seen him since or had any communication with him. So I had a dream where I was looking for him in a house and I was calling his name, very like this urgency to find him. And I was looking and I finally opened a closet door and there were all these children in the closet, kind of like they were hiding. And I said, Gary, is Gary in here? And they all kind of giggled and ran out of the closet, and Gary wasn't there. And I woke up and I felt very distressed that I had not found him. And of course, I was only 11, so I didn't really know what to make of this dream. I just thought, well, that was just kind of a funny dream, and I don't know why I dreamt about Gary.
Welcome to Pass It On with Amy Warren, a podcast where we bring teens, parents, grandparents, and Christian leaders and thinkers to the table to discuss hard questions, find common ground, and pass on the historic Christian faith. Recent headlines in the social media have been saturated with news about aliens and UFO activity. New Age practices are being embraced by Christian churches, and popular teen books and movies are increasingly being saturated in occult and sexual content. How can Christians think rightly about these issues? And how can we equip our children and teenagers to stand against ideas that distort the true gospel of Jesus Christ as we work to pass on the faith? Today, we will talk about all of these issues and more. And so let's meet today's guest. Before trusting Christ, Marcia Montenegro was a professional astrologer and taught astrology, as well as having been involved in Eastern spiritual and New Age practices for many years. Through her ministry, Christian Answers for the New Age, Marcia has spoken around the country in interviews and writes on New Age and occult topics published in magazines, journals, and books. She has a master's in religion from Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, and serves as a missionary with Fellowship International Mission in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Based in Arlington, Virginia, she is the mother of an adult son and author of Spellbound, The Paranormal Seduction of Today's Kids, and co-author of Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret. Marcia, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello, Amy. Thank you for having me on your program.
I wanted to start with a story that I heard you referenced in another interview about when you were 11 and an incident that triggered your interest in the New Age. Occult, I think, is what you mentioned. But first, let's define our terms for our listeners. If you will, what is the New Age, New Thought, the occult? Are these all the same thing? Are they different things? We hear these terms fly around. Let's, for our listeners, kind of get our terms defined here so that we can have a more effective conversation.
Okay, sure. I will try to do this very succinctly because that question you just asked me, I could do the whole program just on that one question. You wouldn't be able to ask me anything else. So the New Age, I define as a network of beliefs that are mainly influenced and come from Eastern religions, Gnosticism, and the New Thought movement. So the New Thought movement is distinct from the New Age, but the New Age draws on the New Thought movement and incorporates a lot. So I'll get to the New Thought in a minute. So the New Age is very broad. So when people think of the New Age, they should think of it as this very broad thing that has a big spectrum in it that goes from Gnostic to Eastern religions to New Thought. And you can find people anywhere on the spectrum mixing these areas together, or maybe more focused on one of those areas, or on the teachings from a group that was based on one of those areas, like Theosophy, which was kind of an occult group that started in the 1800s and still exists. So there's a lot of components to the New Age, and that's one reason it's very difficult to talk about it clearly or for people to understand it or identify it, because it is so broad, and it often it's disguised because it will use words that are familiar to you but the New Age has a different meaning for them. So that is one of the sources of confusion about the New Age. Now, the occult I define as a set of practices associated with different beliefs. So you can find occult practices in shamanism, animistic cultures. You find it in the New Age. You find it in some religions. Folk religions rely a lot on occult practices. And the occult basically is all the practices of the occult are listed in Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12. So the occult's a little easier to define than the New Age because you can actually describe the practices, divination, sorcery, spirit contact. And those three areas include a lot of things, but those are like the three main categories. And so occult practices, and of course you find those in modern movements like witchcraft and Wicca. Which I kind of put under the umbrella of occult, but yet they're kind of their own distinct category too. But they do occult practices, but so do New Agers. Now, the worldview in the occult tends to be different from the New Age, and that's one reason I make a distinction from them. Because in the New Age, it's very future oriented. It's all about your spiritual path and how you're evolving spiritually. Usually there's a belief in reincarnation, and you're trying to evolve beyond the material world. That's the Gnostic part of it. So you're trying to get beyond the material world is dense, it holds you back, or it's just an illusion. So you find that kind of thinking in the New Age, but not so much in the occult. The occult actually will see the material world as sacred, as having sacred energy in it, and it's more focused on the here and now and not as future oriented. People in the occult are more focused on using their powers or their gifts or whatever now, and usually they're very creation oriented, they're very earth oriented. Now, you do find some of this in the New Age too, and that's what makes it confusing, but I'm giving some broader kinds of markers here. So, I'm not saying you don't ever find those views in the New Age. And you do have people who are in the occult and will be an occult practitioner who take on New Age views. So, there's a lot of crossover there. As far as New Thought goes, New Thought is a movement that really started way back in the 18th century with a man named Emanuel Swedenborg in Sweden, who began to receive, well, he claims he began to receive messages from angels. He was Lutheran and had been raised in the Lutheran faith, but he started getting these messages from angels, and he eventually formed a theology out of this. And some of his ideas were that heaven and hell are states of mind. Illness does not really exist. It's caused by bad thinking. These ideas were taken up by people that were followers of Swedenborg, and those teachings from those people, that for a long time it wasn't really, you couldn't really identify it as a separate thing. It was just part of other things, especially spiritualism, which is the belief in contact with the dead and getting information from the dead. So there were a lot of people into spiritualism who started adopting the New Thought ideas. But it kind of coalesced in the 1800s and became more of a distinct thing from spiritualism in the late 1800s. And the New Thought movement led to three churches that still exist today. The Christian Science Church, which probably most people have heard of. Mary Baker Eddy was the founder of that church. She was very influenced by Quimby, who was a New Thought teacher. He was one of the early New Thought leaders, and she was very influenced by Quimby. A lot of people say she actually stole some of Quimby's ideas and plagiarized his writing. So, there's charges of that. And so the Christian Science Church came out of that. Now, she added her own teachings, and of course she presented it as Christianity, and it's called the Christian Science Church. This is the other thing about the New Thought movement, is that it presents itself as Christian. So the New Age is very broad. So when people think of the New Age, they should think of it as this very broad thing that has a big spectrum in it that goes from Gnostic to Eastern religions to New Thought. And you can find people anywhere on the spectrum mixing these areas together, or maybe more focused on one of those areas, or on the teachings from a group that that was based on one of those areas, like Theosophy, which is a was a kind of an occult group that started in the 1800s and still exists. So there's a lot of components to the New Age, and that's one reason it's very difficult to talk about it clearly or for people to understand it, or identify it, because it is so broad, and it often it's disguised because it will use words that are familiar to you but the New Age has a different meaning for them. So that is one of the sources of confusion about the New Age. Now, the occult I define as a set of practices associated with different beliefs. So you can find occult practices in shamanism, animistic cultures. You find it in the New Age. You find it in some religions. Folk religions rely a lot on occult practices. And the occult basically is all the practices of the occult are listed in Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12. So the occult's a little easier to define than the New Age because you can actually describe the practices, divination, sorcery, spirit contact. And those three areas include a lot of things, but those are like the three main categories. And so occult practices, and of course you find those in modern movements like witchcraft and Wicca, which I kind of put under the umbrella of occult, but yet they're kind of their own distinct category too. But they do occult practices, but so do New Agers. Now, the worldview in the occult tends to be different from the New Age, and that's one reason I make a distinction from them, because in the New Age, it's very future-oriented. It's all about your spiritual path and how you're evolving spiritually. Usually there's a belief in reincarnation, and you're trying to evolve beyond the material world. That's the Gnostic part of it. So you're trying to get beyond the material world is dense, it holds you back, or it's just an illusion. So you find that kind of thinking in the New Age, but not so much in the occult. The occult actually will see the material world as sacred, as, having sacred energy in it. And it's more focused on the here and now and not as future oriented. People in the occult are more focused on using, their powers or their gifts or whatever now. And usually they're very creation oriented. They're very earth oriented. Now, you do find some of this in the New Age too, and that's what makes it confusing. But, I'm giving some broader kinds of markers here. So, I'm not saying you don't ever find those views in the New Age. And you do have people who are in the occult and will be an occult practitioner who take on New Age views. So, there's a lot of crossover there. As far as New Thought goes, New Thought is a movement that really started way back in the 18th century with a man named Emanuel Swedenborg in Sweden, who began to receive, well, he claims he began to receive messages from angels. He was Lutheran and had been raised in the Lutheran faith, but he started getting these messages from angels, and he eventually formed a theology out of this. And some of his ideas were that heaven and hell are states of mind. Illness does not really exist. It's caused by bad thinking. These ideas were taken up by people that were followers of Swedenborg, and those teachings from those people, that for a long time it wasn't really, you couldn't really identify it as a separate thing. It was just part of other things, especially spiritualism, which is the belief in contact with the dead and getting information from the dead. So there were a lot of people into spiritualism who started adopting the New Thought ideas. But it kind of coalesced in the 1800s, and became more of a distinct thing from spiritualism in the late 1800s. And it became the New Thought movement led to three churches that still exist today. The Christian Science Church, which probably most people have heard of. Mary Baker Eddy was the founder of that church. She was very influenced by Quimby, who was a New Thought teacher. He was one of the early New Thought leaders, and she was very influenced by Quimby. A lot of people say she actually stole some of Quimby's ideas and and plagiarized his writing. So, there's charges of that. Um, and so the Christian Science Church came out of that. Now she added her own teachings, and of course she presented it as Christianity, and it's called the Christian Science Church.
Okay, I've heard of
This
that.
is the other thing about the New Thought movement is that it presents itself as Christian, whereas the New Age does not. There are people in the New Age who might say they're Christians, but normally they might say they're a mystical Christian or a mystic or a Christian mystic. Most New Agers won't try to say they're Christians, or they'll redefine the term, whereas New Thought will say, yes, that we're a part of Christianity. This is Christianity. The other two churches that came out of it are the Unity, which used to be called the Unity School of Christianity, and that was founded in the early 1900s. And Unity is actually pretty big. Probably most large cities in the United States have a Unity church. Now, that is not the same as Unitarian. Let me quickly say that Unitarian has a completely different history. And although you can find New Agers in both churches, they're very different. I just don't want people to confuse them because it's easy with the name. So Unity is probably, to me, is has a lot of new aginess about it, but they are very clear that they are not New Age, and now they are even saying that they're not New Thought. But actually, they came out of the New Thought movement, but they don't like to be identified with it. They will talk a lot about Jesus and God. But here again, the views are very different. Jesus is a man who realized his divine nature and attained Christ consciousness. And this is something all of us can do. Now, that idea of Christ consciousness is in the New Age. That's one of the New Thought ideas that the New Age adopted. So you'll hear it in New Thought and New Age. The other church that came out of New Thought was the Church of Religious Science, which changed its name not all that long ago, around 2014 or so. It changed its name to Centers for Spiritual Living. I think that's the name. I always forget because it's so long. It's very odd that they changed to that name, but they did. But their teachings focus very much on the idea that there are these spiritual laws running the universe. And when you discover these spiritual laws, you can use them for your own benefit. So affirmations come from the founder of that church. Affirmations where you say things, and by saying them and believing them, you will manifest them. They'll come true. Unfortunately, that idea seeped into the church. And so there was a lot of New Thought techniques, and actually Norman Vincent Peale studied the teachings of Ernest Holmes, who was the co-founder of that church, and brought those ideas into the church because he was a Christian minister. He had a huge church in New York City, very influential with his book, The Power of Positive Thinking. And so New Thought did creep into the church. And one of the confusing things about New Thought is because it identifies as Christian and refers to the Bible and refers to Jesus, a lot of people get deceived by New Thought teachings, thinking that they're Christian. And I have seen a lot of that. And I do end up talking about New Thought a lot because of that, and because it's a big component of the New Age movement. But yet it's a distinct movement from the New Age. They're not the same thing. They shouldn't be equated. But there's a lot of overlap there. So that's the occult, the New Age, and New Thought in a nutshell.
And so with that, with our terms defined, talk a little bit about this incident that occurred when you were 11 years old and your
Okay.
subsequent pursuing of New Age and occult practices.
Okay, sure. Yes, I had a dream, and it was very vivid. It was about a little boy I had known when I was 5 years old, and we had lived in Northern Virginia at that time. And we had left Northern Virginia when I was still five, and I had not seen him since or had any communication with him. So I had a dream where I was looking for him in a house, and I was calling his name, and I was going into every room and opening the door and saying, Gary, Gary. And I felt very like this urgency to find him. And I was looking, and I finally opened a closet door, and there were all these children in the closet, kind of like they were hiding. And I said, Gary, is Gary in here? And they all kind of giggled and ran out of the closet, and Gary wasn't there. And I woke up, and I felt very distressed that I had not found him. And of course, I was only 11, so I didn't really know what to make of this dream. I just thought, well, that was just kind of a funny dream. And I don't know why I dreamt about Gary, because I haven't even ever thought of him, for years. I mean, a lot happens between the ages of 5 and 11. You don't think about when you were 5 years old when you're 11.
That's right.
I just, kind of forgot about it. But then about 2 months later, I was in the car with my mother, and she said, I need to tell you about something. She said, do you remember little Gary Gates? And I said, oh, I said, yeah, I remember playing with him, because I did remember playing with him, partly because my father was really into filming everything, and he had filmed me and Gary, like going down a snowy hill on a sled, that kind of thing. And I'd seen all those family things. And so it was etched in my mind. And she said, well, she said, I got a letter from a family that knows his family, and he died. And I said, he died? And she said, yeah, he died of leukemia. And I said, and when she said that, I remembered the dream. I think I remembered it then. And then I asked her when he died, and she said she wasn't sure, about 2 months earlier. And in my mind, I'm thinking that's about when I had the dream. Of course, I don't know exactly if it was, when I had the dream, but it was about that time. And it made a really strong impression on me, because I thought, there's something there. It's like I had the dream, and I couldn't find him because he was dead or about to die. And I thought, why would I have a dream like that when I haven't even thought about him and I have no idea what's going on with him? Why would I dream? Because so to me, the dream meant that some part of me knew he had died, and that was communicated in the dream. And so I was kind of interested in the idea of this knowledge you could have that was beyond the five senses. I didn't have a name for it, and I didn't understand it, but that made me very interested in those kind of things. That interest continued and picked up more when I was a teenager. Okay.
That's fascinating.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
what do
I
you
don't usually talk about it. Sometimes I do. It depends on how the, interview's going, and if it would. Sometimes it's a good thing to tell, because that's the kind of thing that can, lead you into something.
Absolutely.
It arouses your curiosity and your interest. And I do want to say, in terms of explaining the dream, of course, you can't rule out coincidence. Now,
Right.
I think it's kind of, if it is coincidence, it's definitely against the odds that would happen, but it is still could be coincidence. My other explanation for it is that it was demonic, in that I do believe Satan, the enemy. I was not a Christian when I had this dream. I became a Christian later, much, much later in life. I mean, I wasn't even a young adult when I became a Christian. I was an older adult. So um, I wasn't a Christian. So I do, and how Satan does this, I don't know, and I don't think we should try to figure it out because the
Right.
Lord doesn't give us a lot of information on how Satan does what he does.
Right.
We know what he does. We know he tempts. We know he
Right.
is behind false teachings. We know he disguises himself as something good. So
Right.
that's all we need to know.
That's right.
But I do think somehow maybe it's possible that that was some kind of demonic thing to get me interested because that did plant a little seed in my
Yeah.
mind,
The
which was
curiosity.
cultivated later. Yeah.
Yeah. What would you say to, say, a parent or a grandparent who has a young person that might be having these seeds sown? Because if it happened to you, right, naturally
Yeah.
it's going to be happening to other young people, especially in this
Oh,
day and
yeah.
age, right?
It
What would you
does. Yeah.
say to a parent, a grandparent? How could they guide their young person into rightly thinking of these kinds of experiences?
Yes, I would say getting some kind of information this way that seems supernatural and beyond the normal means of getting information. Especially something like this, which there is nothing really beneficial to this dream. There was nothing about it that was helpful, really. Um, so I would say there can be explanations, natural explanations for them. Like you might have a dream about something, and maybe, and it's not true for the dream that I had, but in some cases where people have asked me questions about things like that, they'll say, well, how could I have known that or something? Sometimes we see and hear things that we forget about and they come up later in dreams. So you might have a dream about something and then later say, oh, and find out something and say, I didn't know about that, but I had a dream about it. Well, maybe you did know about it and you just forgot. Maybe it's just something you heard. Or for example, I've had people tell me they've had dreams that tell the future. And so, I'll say, look, unless it is very specific, like real specific, uh, it's probably just random, like I'll give you an example from my own life. I had a dream, this was just a few years ago, about a boat sinking in this bay. I watched it sink. And that was pretty much the dream. It was just this very short dream. And then the next day I heard about this boat that sunk somewhere in the Scandinavian area, countries, that was going across the water there. And I thought about it, and I thought, now a lot of people would think, oh wow, I had this dream that was foretelling the the drowning. But what I say is, if that had really been a dream that was giving a future, I would have known the name of the boat. I would have known where it was. I would have known how many passengers drowned. Now, if you put all those things in place, then I might be like, okay, let's think about this some more. But I don't know anybody that has had a dream that was that specific. So you can have things, dreams or ideas that may relate to something that happens later, but if the details are missing, or if it's something kind of general, like a boat sinking, well, there are only so many things you can dream about. And we're going to dream about things we know about in our life. And in my life personally, I've been on a lot of boats, as a matter of fact. I've actually
Right.
traveled on boats quite a bit, probably more than the average person, because I did a lot of traveling growing up. So that I dreamt of a boat is not that unusual. That I dreamt of it sinking might relate to fears I had when I was on boats. And, a few
Hmm.
times there was stormy and it was scary. So there's a lot of explanations we can use to explain these
Right.
things. So what we want to do is we want to be very careful about immediately going to a supernatural explanation. And if it seems like, yes, it must be supernatural, and if the parent thinks that this is, not a good thing, then you just tell the child, we're not going to pay any attention to this. We're not going to give it special value. It's not important to your life, and we're just going to ask God to help us forget it and not give it any focus. You don't want to focus on it because that's
Right.
what creates the interest. So you don't want to make a big deal out of it. So I don't know. That would be my approach. I usually, that's what I tell Christians who tell me about these things. I give them the possible explanations, and then I tell them, now in this case, I'm talking to adult Christians, and I'll say, if you think you have this kind of ability or something, or these kind of dreams, ask God to remove them if they
Right.
aren't from him.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to give a lot of focus to it, but you do want to address it and not help it create an interest in that area.
That's good. That's good. And I think probably another helpful tip for parents would be to make sure you're talking about the attributes of the Holy Spirit to your children.
Mm-hmm.
That way they understand.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Yes,
that way they
excellent.
understand, man, let me compare this to what I know is good, true, and beautiful, right?
Absolutely. That's so good, Amy. Yes,
Yeah.
because you can talk about, this is what the Holy Spirit does. He doesn't give you strange kinds of information.
Or
That's not
fear.
the yeah, or fear.
Yeah.
He's not there to tell he's not a psychic.
Right.
So he's not there to tell you the future or turn you into a psychic. He's there to guide you through understanding God's word, convicting you of sin,
Right.
leading you in prayer, et cetera, et cetera. It's all going to be Christ oriented and oriented
Yeah.
towards God's word.
Yeah.
It's not going to be these little pieces of information or whatever. So the Holy Spirit doesn't do that. He's not a
That's right.
psychic.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's good.
That's a very good point. Knowing the attributes of God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit and their roles, what the Bible says who they are and what they do, is really a good foundation that will
Absolutely.
help your child be guarded against this kind of deception.
Absolutely. I agree. That's wonderful. Now let's talk a little bit about some recent headline news that is affecting a lot of teenagers today, and this is witnessing from some social media trending things that are trending in social media. And so, just last week, a House Oversight Subcommittee heard testimony from 3 former military officials that the government knows more about UAPs, or unidentified aerial phenomena, or
Oh,
formerly known as UFOs, than they are revealing to the public. And so, among these claims are that the government is not only in possession of some debris, right, from crashed UAPs, but also that they have seen objects flying at speeds that humans supposedly cannot survive. Well, Christian pastor, he's an astrophysicist, an author. I'm sure you've heard of him, is Hugh Ross. And he wrote a
oh
book
yeah.
called Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And he also has a talk on YouTube for our listeners if they want to check that out. And so in his book, he outlines his decades of experience researching UFO sighting claims. And he concluded that 99% of this phenomena have natural explanations, like
Yep.
planets and stars and clusters
Yeah.
and military exercises, and sometimes hoaxes, right, with this
Right.
new technology that we have with, these what do you call them?
Drones.
Drones. That's the
Yeah.
word I was
Yeah.
looking for. Drones. And so, but he says that there is at least 1% that is real. And in researching these encounters, he found that every person who had experienced some kind of encounter, whether it was a sighting, a crash, communication with these beings, or an actual abduction, or even death, and sometimes the death of their animals, had been involved or deeply involved in occult practices, or even had close relatives involved in occult practices. Now, he concludes that these encounters are real, but are demonic in nature due to the evidence of occult involvement. And I'm sure you've heard of this, but he also offers the Urantia book as evidence of the demonic nature of this phenomenon. Now, for our listeners, the Urantia book, from my understanding, according to Ross, is a book that was written by someone who had claimed to be abducted by aliens. And he says that while in this trance, the person auto-wrote about 4,000 pages. And in this volume, a third of it denies the deity of Christ.
Oh yeah.
It promises power. And the ultimate goal for the reader is to end their life. And so this is so relevant, Marcia, for our teens today, because just last week, TikTok's data reported that #aliens had received approximately 60 million views.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And so, as someone was deep into New Age and understands these occult practices, Did you see this overlap in phenomena and the occult the way Dr. Ross claims? I mean, what is your insight on this?
Everything you said about what he said in his book is stuff I was saying as a new Christian. In fact, my very first article that was published by Watchman Fellowship, which is a very good ministry, was on UFOs, where I wrote that I believed that anything that was could not be ruled out as natural or as a natural or as a lie or a hoax. You know what? If you can rule those factors out, which are the reasons for a lot of these things, or most of them, if there's anything actually going on there, then it's demonic.
Right.
So I knew about the book. I think it's called Communion, and the man who wrote it, I can't think of his name, but he had been very deeply involved in the occult. And he writes a book about his interaction with these so-called aliens. But I've always thought that. So everything you just said, he said in his book, I already thought that years ago. I agree with him that most of it can be explained naturally. And of course, we have to remember when you say unidentified flying objects, which now they've changed to this other term, that does not automatically mean something from another planet. It just means it's unidentified. That's
Right.
all it means. It's just part of something. It could be a weather balloon or some kind of military object that was used experimentally but not identified as of yet that somebody saw. So all it means is that it hasn't been identified. It doesn't mean that nobody knows what it is or we can't know what it is. So we need to keep that in mind. I think there's this mystique around, the idea of aliens and UFOs and everything. There's this whole mystique and this fascination with the idea of these beings coming to us from other planets. So I agree. Almost all of that is natural explanations or hoaxes or imagination. Um, or it is demonic. I personally believe my own view is that there is not intelligent life, anything like humans on other planets. I don't know. There might be little bacteria type things or something. I wouldn't call them intelligent life, you know. So I don't think there's any intelligent life. God's very clear in the Bible how man is made in His image. And furthermore, whenever the Bible references stars and everything, it's always to show God's handiwork. It's always to glorify God. It's to show God as the creator, and it is to show that there is evidence for a creator. This vast universe, and the fact that the universe is so vast, and that astronomers say we don't even know how many galaxies they are because we can't even see that far, and we just know there's this huge number of galaxies we've been able to detect, but there's no end to it. It's like it goes on, and I think the vastness of our universe reflects the infinity of our creator. God cannot be contained. He's way beyond anything, and so the universe he created is the same way. We can't take a telescope and look out and say, okay, now I've counted 2,400 galaxies. There's the end of the universe. It goes on because we can't possibly see the end of it because God is God and this is his creation. So I think that the creation reflects the majesty of the creator and the greatness of the creator. And I don't think we have to think that there's this very popular idea I've heard for years, even before I was a Christian. Well, why should we think we're the only, people in the universe or the only intelligent life? Well, I think there's good reasons to think that, and I think they're all biblical. And until there's been actually no concrete evidence of any aliens. There's no concrete evidence, and all these stories and claims. And yes, the government may have hidden some of the reports of this because it may have to do with military secrets that they don't want to reveal to people who are against our country. So you don't reveal everything because if you do, you just open the door to a lot of problems from countries who don't like us, and there are plenty of countries who don't like us. So, yeah, they may not reveal everything, but I don't find that suspicious. So yeah, that's my thing on aliens. Now, I was not really into them, but of course a lot of new agers are. I had a housemate who used to listen to somebody called the Space Brothers. And these were supposed messages from aliens who were giving messages to the earth about what you needed to do when there's always this idea of a big calamity coming, and that you have to know where to go to be safe. So sometimes he would tell me, "Oh, I just listened to a Space Brothers message, Marcia, and we need to go to the mountains of Colorado." So, okay, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia. I had no intention of going to Colorado. And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "That's the place to be because, there's going to be this flood and the highest mountains will be safe, so we can go to Colorado." He wasn't saying we should go right now, but he's saying this was the message. This is what people need to keep in mind. And so he would give me these messages from the Space Brothers from time to time. And I did not believe them. I mean, I believed that I believed what he said, that he heard these words, and I believed that that's what was being said. But I didn't believe in the source. I didn't know what to think of it. I just kind of brushed it off because I wasn't interested in it. But, I believed other things. I believed in reincarnation. So it's not like I was being real clear headed or anything. I had my own beliefs that would a lot of people would find very strange, but that was one area that I just didn't give a lot of weight to.
Interesting. Interesting. And the other thing he had mentioned is, none of these encounters are beneficial. Like
Right.
that's one thing that is different from the Lord. If the Lord is going to give you a warning, right? The warning is going to be for the purposes of removing that which is affecting your relationship with him. But it's not going to be something that is filled with fear or dread
Right.
or wanting
Right.
to end your life or any of
Right.
those things. None of those things are going to
Exactly.
come from what is good.
No, exactly. Yeah, it's not going to be helpful and edifying. And that's what a lot of this stuff is. It does inspire fear, or it kind of triggers an interest in the idea of communicating with aliens, which a lot of people have claimed. And of course, when they're getting real communication, which I do believe does happen, this is demonic.
Hmm.
I used to read several books by a woman named Ruth Montgomery, who used to be a journalist for for the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
And she started getting messages on her, like she would be typing, and I can't remember if she was asking questions or if it just happened out of the blue, but she started getting messages, like she said, just coming through, and her fingers just automatically typing things. And she finally said she discovered that these were beings in other dimensions. This was kind of like aliens, but it's sort of even beyond that. They're kind of like these spiritual beings in these other dimensions. I can't remember if she called them aliens. And they were higher. They had more advanced, spiritually, they were more advanced. This is usually the scenario
Right.
in this kind of New Age take on it. And so they're giving advice to her to pass on in her books about what people need to be aware of and need to do. And I read about, oh my goodness, I read several of her books. And I remember the book that really affected me was about the walk ins. And the walk ins are, what happens is these people communicating with Ruth Montgomery, who were in these other areas of the universe, would want to come to Earth to help people here, to help people directly and help teach people, but they would need a body. So they would find somebody who didn't want to live anymore
Mm.
and take over their body. And they would do an exchange. And the person would be willing to give up their body and let their spirit go wherever, so
Mm.
that the alien person, or whatever you want to call them, could come in and take their body. And she had a whole book on this, where she had conversations with walk-ins and everything. And that fascinated me so much. I
Wow.
mean, I actually did, even though I rejected the other UFO stuff and the Space Brother thing. I actually I kind of believed the things she was writing, that she was
Mhm.
really getting messages from.
Yeah.
I thought they were like advanced spiritual beings. I thought they were maybe people who had died and were enlightened and were in other areas of the universe. So I kind of was influenced by that side of it, which was a little different than the regular alien kind of thing that we've been talking about. But still, there's some similarities.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Absolutely. So what are ways, Marcia, that you've seen in your practice, in your ministry, that teens and adults get involved in a cult practice? What are some of the lures?
Oh boy, there's really a lot. There's so many. I think that a lot of it is through entertainment. Um, Movies, even animated shows, animated programs introduce a lot of these ideas. A lot of movies, video games. I know at one time video games was one of the main purveyors of occult ideas, and probably still is. I have not really checked into video games a lot lately, but I used to when they were more of a thing and people talked about them more and I was asked about them more. Of course, you can't keep up with them because so many new video games would come out every day. But some of the major ones I would look at, and there's a lot of online things you can do now too that make it more interactive, which in a way which of course I think is more dangerous because it's more seductive. So I think you have to look in the world of entertainment, and in fact, I have a book on that called Spellbound: The Paranormal Seduction of Today's Kids. Now, you have to buy it from a seller, and unfortunately, the prices sometimes are ridiculous. I don't know how this happens, but the book will be like $110 or something. I mean, I don't understand it. And then sometimes it'll go back down. It'll go back down to like 15.
Gotcha.
Um, but I think you can get it on Kindle for under $10. I can't remember. I don't know what it is now, but it's cheap on Kindle. And it is a little outdated because it came out in 2006, and I'm actually thinking of having it republished. I
Hmm.
have a friend who said he might do that. I would have to go through it and update it, and I haven't gotten to that yet. But I explain the occult. I go through Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12. I break down the Hebrew words there and how they correlate with words you see in our English Bibles. So, the divination and sorcery
Right.
and spirit contact are all covered there. And then each chapter is on a different area of the occult. And I talk about how we see this in the culture. And a lot of it is through entertainment and
Hmm.
through books.
Yeah.
So books that children read, that teenagers read, young adults read, that promote ideas of having supernatural powers as a good thing. That's one of the main things I tell parents to watch out for. Is the main character somebody who has some kind of supernatural power? And does that supernatural power correlate to one of the things that are listed in Deuteronomy 18?
Mm.
Because you could have a supernatural power that's fantasy. And I am not against fantasy. Fantasy is fine, it's just imagination. So I always give the example of Superman. Okay, he had x ray vision and he could fly. Um, those are not occult powers, they're fantasy powers. Okay, there's nothing uh, in the occult about having x-ray vision and seeing through buildings or flying over tall buildings or like Superman or anything. So that's like so I don't consider Superman an occult figure. He's just a fantasy figure. But then you look into other things where people have powers to read them others minds, or they can move objects with their mind. Now you're getting into an occult area because that is something that is an occult practice. So do the main characters, are they do they possess supernatural powers that are like that? Do they cast spells, for example? Okay, that would be a red flag. Um, in a movie too, are the main characters doing casting spell? Of course, I'm assuming that a lot of people listening are thinking of Harry Potter. And I do have on my website, christiananswersnewage.com, which is a new website. It only went up, I don't know, a month or two ago. So it's a new one. But of course, my other articles are on there and I have new articles on there. If you put Harry Potter in the search box, I have articles on every Harry Potter book and every Harry Potter movie. I read every single book. I took copious notes. I spent hours. I don't know. I must have spent hundreds of hours on the Harry Potter series, if you count all the time I spent watching the movies and writing about the movies too. So, I what I found in that book is that there are a lot of occult concepts that are promoted. Now, am not saying anything about the author being part of the occult. I don't think she is. I think that she doesn't maybe realize these are occult things. I think that she did some research and she found it interesting, and maybe she thinks it's fantasy. I don't know what she thinks. But really, what the author thinks or what she believes, really in this case doesn't matter. We just want to look at the book and what you find in the book. The book promotes actual occult practices I'm familiar with. So that was one of my concerns, and that was why I started having to warn about Harry Potter. And it was not very popular. I can tell you that right now. It was not popular to warn. It's still not popular to warn about Harry Potter. There's a whole generation that grew up on Harry Potter. I think they're probably like what, in their 20s now, maybe even their early 30s, and they grew up. And I'm talking about people in the church too. So I don't want to say, I don't want anyone to feel guilty that they read Harry Potter or they like it. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to assess things through scripture
Right.
and through what the Lord says and to recognize it. I don't think reading a book is a sin. So in most cases. I'm not trying to make anybody, feel bad or something. I just want to point out how it's in our culture, how it so easily gets in.
That's good.
Because after Harry Potter and it's became so popular, more books like that started
Oh,
getting.
absolutely.
It opened a door, and I said that was one of my concerns at the time. I said one of my concerns is that more publishers will publish books
Yeah.
like this, and we'll see more books and more movies. So I think the entertainment area for children and young teens is just awash with occult
Yeah.
things.
Yep.
You don't have to look very far to find it. So it's very good. I in my book, the idea of my book is, I was asked to write the book by Cook, and they told me they wanted a book as a guide for parents.
Hmm.
So my idea was to point out what the occult is and explain it, and where we can see it in the culture, and then how you talk about it to your child. So there's
Great.
suggestions at the end of each chapter on how to do that. So
Wonderful.
you sit them down and you can show them passages in scripture where what God
Wonderful.
says, because if it's in the Bible, there's no reason not to show it to your child. And you explain that God is against these practices, and he even says why. The reason he's against them is because these practices were done by people who worshiped false gods.
Hmm.
These were the methods they used to communicate with their gods or with spirits.
Yeah.
So, their way of getting information and getting answers was to look for signs, look for
Yeah.
signs in the sky, look for omens, try to hear from, communicate from the dead, communication from the dead. This was their way of getting information from false gods and
Yeah.
false spirits, because they had rejected the true God. And so
Yeah.
these were their practices. And that's why the occult is so evil. It's
Yeah.
associated with the worship of false gods and has nothing to do with the true living God. And
Absolutely.
those practices and things have never gone away. They just take new form, new disguises.
It seems also like it's becoming more insidious. I recently went to a
Yeah.
big box bookstore, and like you said, I always go to look at the teen section to see what they're peddling to the teenagers, and it is saturated, like you said, with
Mm-hmm.
occult content.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing is now it's not just occult content; it is occult and romance. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're bringing these things together now, and some of these sections are actually labeled teen paranormal romance.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Yes, that's really, yeah. See, it's just,
Because sex is such a big allure, right?
yes, right.
It's such a big allure. And with that, they are mixing the paranormal, the occult.
Yeah, kind of like what happened. Now, Twilight, I also have articles on Twilight. Twilight was not pure occultism per se.
Okay.
But there were some occult concepts in there. The author was Mormon, and there are actually a lot of Mormon ideas in those
I did
books.
not know that.
Yeah,
Interesting. Okay.
there's a lot of Mormon ideas. And when I was writing on the book, and I knew she was a Mormon, I found some websites where people who had been Mormons were writing about the book and how they saw the Mormon ideas in there.
Which
Um,
Mormonism for our listeners is not occult, but it is a cult.
It is a cult. Yes, it claims to be Christian, but it does not
Right.
teach the Christian faith.
Right.
And their Jesus is not the biblical Jesus, and their God is not the biblical God. Although they can sound very Christian, that's the problem.
Right.
That's the problem with dealing with the Mormons, is that they can sound very Christian. And so, yeah, Stephanie Meyer's a Mormon.
Hmm.
And some of the ideas there, and then there, for example, like one of the ideas of the vampire is, when you're a vampire, you don't ever sleep. You don't need to sleep anymore. And you can do all these things. He could fly and do all these kind of supernatural things. And supposedly that's a Mormon idea, that when you get your exaltation, these are some of the powers and things that you can do. Now that's what
Okay.
I read. I'm not an expert on Mormonism, so I don't know,
Right.
but that was something that was pointed out in one of the things I read. But what was interesting to me is the way she got the idea for the book. Now, I do think this is occultic.
Okay.
She said that she had a dream, and she dreamt that, this is Stephanie Meyer, the author I'm talking about. And this was in an interview she did. And
Okay.
she saw in this meadow, this beautiful meadow, and in the meadow she saw this young man and this young woman, and they loved each other, but he was afraid he was going to hurt her, or he could hurt her. Now, I'm not clear. I can't remember if she said in the dream she realized the guy was a vampire or not. But this gave her the idea for the series, for this kind of forbidden romance. This guy who had supernatural powers or something could hurt this young girl. And that gave her the idea for the books. And then what really got me, okay, that could be that in itself was not occultic, but what I'm about to tell you about what happened later is, which makes me think that part is occultic. Later,
Okay.
she had another interview, and she said that the character, uh, what was his name? Was it Edward? I think, yeah, Edward, the vampire in Twilight, came to her, and he was very angry. In the dream, he was enraged because in the book she makes Edward and his clan don't take blood from people, they only take it from animals. And so Edward was a quote unquote good vampire.
Hmm.
Well, he was mad at her. This in her dream, this Edward figure went on, and she said it was actually terrifying to her. Now, to me, my assessment of this whole thing, and I know I could be wrong, so I don't
Uh-huh.
want anyone to take this as, necessarily true. I think that the idea for the dream and seeing that couple in the field was demonic.
Hmm.
I think that was possibly a spirit guide, and Edward, who appeared to her, was demonic, was a demon.
Demonic. Yeah.
And now Mormons are very open to spirit guides because they're okay with getting communication from the dead, because they have
Right.
this whole big thing about their ancestors and everything. So,
Right.
and I've been told by friends of mine who are experts in Mormon, they're in Mormon ministry, and they're experts in the Mormon religion and the Mormon history. They have told me themselves that yes, Mormons are very open to communication from spirits and from the dead. So to me, that means Stephanie Meyer very possibly was actually getting inspiration from a demon, and this demon
Right.
showed up very angry
Right.
because of the way she was writing about her main vampire figure. And it even had Bella, the main character, who said she was willing to give up going to heaven, because the idea was, you would be, if you're a vampire, you're going to be, you're never going to get to heaven. And
Okay.
so, but she says to Edward that she's willing to give up heaven to
Hmm.
be with him, to become a vampire and be with him. So, and there's a
Interesting.
few statements like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a very anti-Christian. The series is very anti-Christian.
I remember when the craze came out. Like, I never watched it. My girls never watched it. We never became interested in those things. But I remember the craze. I remember the Twilight craze. And there's still young people that are now young adults, like you said, that still refer to it, still talk about the
Yeah,
characters. Like they're so enamored by them. Like
I
their
know.
lives were changed by these characters. And so, yeah, you're right. These entertainment, books, media, movies, all of these things really form people's worldview. And when their worldview is formed in this way, they really do open up their lives to the darkness.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because see, all it takes is this little spark of interest,
Yeah,
and then it becomes very consuming because it's almost addictive. I think once you get into these areas, if you have an interest and that interest is fed and cultivated, it's like an addiction. You just want more and more and more. You can never
yeah,
get enough of it, just like a drug.
yeah,
And I think that's one of the dangers. And a lot of people don't understand that. And so they don't see the real danger of it. They think, oh, well, it's just fantasy. And I was told that so many times about Harry Potter. It's just fantasy. And, I said, but it's promoting occult concepts. I'm not
right.
against fantasy. What I'm against is promotion of occult concepts
Gotcha.
and practices. And they're not real blatant. They're not obvious, but I could recognize them in the Harry Potter. And anybody from the occult or the New Age. I mean, I had a call from somebody who's now with the Lord, but she was a Christian who exposed the New Age. Carol, I think, was it Carol Matriciano? I can never say her name right. I think it was her. Was it another one? No, I think it was her. And she died several years ago. She actually called me. I had never spoken to her before, and she was reading Harry Potter like I was. And she wanted to talk to me about an incident in one of the Harry Potter books because when she read it, it gave her the idea of something from the New Age, and it had hit me the same way.
Oh,
And
wow.
she said, when I read that part of the story, I immediately thought of this. And I said, I
Wow.
did too. And we both talked about it. This was summoning the Patronus, and I did a Facebook post on it. So that was very similar to what's called a thought form. And it's actually a practice that comes from Tibetan Buddhism, where you create this independent entity from your mind, um, called a tulpu, I think it is, a tulpu or tulko. And there was a horror film made about it. And I don't know how it got from there into but that may be something actually that you may find very common in a lot of shamanistic and animistic cultures.
Mm,
You find a lot of similarities in a lot of cultures from these kind of occult ideas. And so that's what it made me think of. And it also made me think of the Animal Spirit Guide. And do you know that they actually have cartoons and things for children? Some of them are on YouTube because I watch them about finding your animal spirit guide. And there's books on
mm.
how to find your animal spirit guide for
Wow.
children. This is for children, not for adults.
Wow.
I did several Facebook posts on it. I also did Facebook posts on this princess character. There was a whole series about her that I can't remember now. And she had a friend, one of the characters in the program, cast spells. And they had a song, Let's Go Cast a Spell. And, this is at least 7 or 8, maybe 9 years ago.
Wow.
So that's how bad it was then.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's only worse now. I
Yeah.
also, for parents who might be interested, I have a very detailed article on my website of the movie Frozen 2, which I think
Oh, okay.
introduces a lot of occult ideas. I explain there how I break the whole movie down. I go through why the ideas are occult, and how it introduces the main character, whose name I've forgotten now. She actually becomes spirit. There's fire, earth, and water,
It's Elsa.
and
I think it's
she becomes
Elsa.
spirit, which is the top part of the pentagram, the witchcraft pentagram: air,
Oh,
earth,
wow.
water, fire, and spirit. And to me, it's very clear that's what the movie's talking about.
Wow.
And now I thought that, and then I came across a review of the movie written by a Wiccan who said the same thing. And I quoted her in my
Wow.
Facebook post because "Oh, I'm
Wow.
so excited because she's talking about the pentagram." And you can see it as
Wow.
spirit or goddess, the top point of the pentagram. So, but you can see other things in it that are occult. It's not just that. So
Yeah.
even if you don't see that, there are other things. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm talking so much about entertainment and books and movies, because I think that's the main way. Unless it's through personal friends, I think that's the main way that occult ideas are introduced to children and young people.
That's great. That is so much good information. And I know these are really good tools. We will definitely be providing links to all of these wonderful resources that you have for parents on our
Okay.
description. It's like a seed. And some parents will say, well, it's just fantasy, like you said. But what they don't realize is, as you did when you were 11 years old, it was a little seed. It was just a seed, but you remember
Yeah.
that, and that
Hmm.
curiosity grows, and the enemy uses that to bring about, opportunities where he will take that seed, have you remember that seed, and then it's
Yeah.
like, oh, well, that pentagram kind of reminds me of, the thing that Elsa was looking at and then the curiosity grows, and then the interest and the lore continues into things that are darker and deeper. And ultimately, always within the dark realm, within the occult, within all of these things that glorify Satan, is always the goal to end your life.
Yeah, that often comes up, that there's some reason that things would be better if you went somewhere
Right.
else.
Yeah, the
And
promise of
so
things.
yeah, the promise of things. And I mean, you even see that in the Twilight thing where she says, "I'm willing to give up heaven and not go from being a human to being a vampire, give
Yeah,
up my
wow.
humanity to becoming a vampire so I can be with Edward." And it just, and I thought, why would parents want their teenage girls to read a book where the girl is like thinking things like that? And
Yeah.
and I think maybe in most cases the parents didn't read the books, and the reason the books were promoted and why Christians told me why they thought they were good is because Edward and Bella will not have premarital sex. And, they won't, Edward's very clear about it. He won't do it, even when Bella kind of wants to do it later on. And I said, but it's not because of any reasons of purity. It's because he's afraid he'd kill her. I said, he's afraid it would unleash something in him. And I
Right.
said,
Right.
that has nothing to do with purity or morality, And it's like they were just looking at it on this very surface level and not understanding what was behind this. And that's what parents really have to, I think, put in some effort to find things out, to investigate things, especially for really young children when they're more in control of what their children read or watch when they're really young. If you're wondering about a book or something, then go look into it. Maybe even read it yourself. I mean, you just have to, because there's just too much of this stuff out there.
Absolutely, that's so good. So one question I hear very, very often is, what is the difference? So what is the difference between C.S. Lewis's Narnia, right, or
Oh, yeah.
Tolkien's Lord of the Rings? When they're talking about wizards and sorcery, why is that good and Harry Potter bad?
Yeah, there are lots of reasons for that. Now, Narnia, I only read one of those books, and I wasn't a Christian when I read it. And to me, it was just kind of an interesting story. I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't know anything about C.S. Lewis when I read it. Um, from what I understand, he does not promote any occult concepts or practices. Now, I'm basing this on a friend of mine, Robert Velarde, who is sort of an expert on C.S. Lewis and has a book on C.S. Lewis on Amazon. If you look up his name, Velarde, I believe he took some courses at SES too. I think he maybe did, the seminary you and I went to. So Robert Velarde has a book on that, and he has told me he does not, and he's very good at recognizing New Age and occult things. So he's very discerning. So I just take his word for that. Nobody's really shown me anything from Narnia that I would call occultic. Okay, now I have a couple of other issues with Narnia, but they're not. It doesn't have to do with the occult. So I won't go into that. So C.S. Lewis's theology. It was not very sound. I think he was a believer, but he did not really have sound theology, and I think that shows up in some places in Narnia. So yeah,
Yeah.
but I think it's the last book or next to last book, which I did not read, but I read a portion of it, and it's where somebody who had worshipped this false god is explaining that he did that, and then he's told that's okay because you were really worshiping me, and it was sort of an inclusivism, which I think that maybe C.S. Lewis might have been an inclusivist, and I've been in discussions on that, so I don't know for sure, but that's one of my concerns. Now, as far as Tolkien goes, because the Tolkien movies, they started making movies on Lord of the Rings. I got those books and I read them. I read all of them. Now, and that's not my thing. That's not my kind of reading material. That's not what I
Yeah.
read out of choice.
It's a lot
So
to read.
this was a chore to read these books, believe me. I mean, some of it was enjoyable, but it was kind of a chore. So I read The Hobbit and then I read the trilogy. Um, and my assessment of Lord of the Rings is that it does not promote any occult practices as a good thing. The only closest thing I saw was where I think it's the Elf Queen looks into some water and she sees something. It's a vision of some people that are coming. And that is an occult practice called scrying, where you look into opaque water or glass or something like that, and you see something. It's the crystal ball thing. But it's that one little incident, and not a whole lot is made of it. I didn't see anything else practiced by the good characters that was occultic. And he used the word wizard to refer to a being who was not human and had supernatural powers. And later he regretted using that word because it was associated with witchcraft and with the occult. And apparently he regretted later using that term. So when he uses the word wizard, when Gandalf is called a wizard, it's not because he's doing occult practices. Okay. The best way to see him is sort of as an angelic figure who has these powers that the creatures like the hobbits and others don't have, and that men don't have. The people in Middle Earth or the creatures of Middle Earth don't have these powers. So he's not an occult wizard. And I thought the theme of Lord of the Rings was very compatible with Scripture in that it's showing that man is consumed by power. When man
Yes.
is given power, he becomes consumed by it and wants more and more, and he'll do anything to get it.
Yeah.
It actually shows the fault of man. And although God's never mentioned, I think there are parts of the book where there is a reference, a kind of, I don't know how you would call it, and it's not really a hidden reference. It's a reference to God, although God's not mentioned and referred to.
Right.
So I did not have an issue with Lord of the Rings at all.
Awesome. Okay. That's
Yeah.
super helpful. The Barna Group has been doing decades of research tracking the state of Christianity. And
Right.
now, while there is a decline on committed Christians, and that decline continues, they actually recently saw an upward tick or an upward trend on spiritual openness in U.S. teenagers. And so their recent US study, which is called the Open Generation, shows that roughly half of US teens, or 52%, are actually very motivated to learn more about Jesus.
Hmm.
And another one fourth of those teenagers is somewhat motivated to do so. And so, knowing the spiritual openness of today's teens, knowing that many may be searching for Jesus and Lord into some cults or religions that, as you say, might use the name of Jesus, might claim Christianity or Christian beliefs,
Right.
and
Right.
actually teach a false gospel that is saturated in, say, New Age or occult. Tell us, Marcia, what about some ways that this is infiltrating the church today?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, and I think there's different ways this can happen. One can be what I already talked about, the New Thought movement. So the Jesus of the New Thought movement is not the biblical Jesus. So any influences from that could be there. There's also in the church a lot of teachings that are coming from groups that are not holding to sound doctrine. And they will claim the name of Jesus. They will even talk about praising Jesus, etc. But their Jesus is not the biblical Jesus. So, and that can come from a few places. One of them, and this we didn't talk about, but I'm just going to mention it because I think it is a danger, is the oneness Pentecostalism, which of course denies the Trinity and says Jesus is God the Father. And you have someone very influential like T.D. Jakes who holds to that view. And he's still perceived by many Christians as a Christian, and he's not. So, there needs to be a real clear distinction drawn there. He's not part of the historic Christian faith. Now, are you
Absolutely.
wanting me to discuss a little bit of the NAR here?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Because
okay.
that's
So,
big. That's big. The music is big. All of that
yes,
is
the
very
music
big.
is
It's
big.
luring a lot of kids.
And they target young people. The New Apostolic Reformation, which I do want people to know is not my area. I do not address this in my ministry. However, I know a lot about it. I do want to say their expert on it is Holly Pivec, Pivec. Maybe you could even interview her, possibly. um, and so this movement is within the church, and it's regarded by a lot of apologists as a cultic movement within the church because their ideas are very unbiblical. For example, they believe that the church needs to restore the offices of apostle and prophet, just like the Old Testament prophets and the apostles who followed Jesus. We need to have people just like that today. And when I'm not talking about the gift of prophecy, I'm talking about really the office of prophet. And these apostles will be in charge of the church and have absolute authority. They believe in this, they're very much into the supernatural, and this is where the big danger is because they're so much into the supernatural. They feel that as Christians, they have the ability to see into the supernatural and to discern things in the supernatural and to use things from the supernatural. So, one of their ideas is that they can take New Age beliefs and practices and quote unquote reclaim them for God. And they believe that these things actually come from God, but were stolen by the enemy. And now Christians can reclaim them. So they will follow a lot of New Age ideas. They will follow ideas from the New Age about healing, energy healing, for example, which is very actually occultic, but is very big in the New Age. Healing with energy, wielding some kind of energy, form of energy, manipulating energy. Um, and they believe that you can do anything Jesus did as a Christian. So you can just heal people supernaturally as a Christian. You should be able to do that. So they have a lot of ideas, and because they're so open to the New Age and they're bringing some New Age ideas into the church, um, and the other part is the positive confession thing, but that really comes from the word of faith. But I think that the word of faith and NAR mingle a lot. I don't follow it, so I'm not really sure, but I think they do mingle. So you also have the idea that if you believe something, although I do think the NAR is into manifesting, so they believe that if you really believe something and you really ask God for it and you believe it, that you will get it, it can manifest, or you can go through certain techniques to manifest it. Now this is really an occult activity, but it's really big in the New Age. It comes from the New Thought movement, where they believe that your mind can alter reality. So by thinking certain things, because everything is spiritualized, you can bring something into material existence. And you do this through different techniques. So a lot of people then they are into these new age and occult practices, and they target young people. And I think they lure a lot of people with these ideas because it makes it seem very exciting. And like this is something new. I never heard this before. I didn't know that I could do that. I didn't know it was okay to do that. Um, and that can be very appealing to teenagers and young adults. So some of those NAR things in the church you have to be careful of. A lot of their books, because they are not a separate denomination, but rather a movement that actually has enabled them to infiltrate churches more easily. Churches, colleges, ministries have been infiltrated. And so you will come across books, maybe, that are by NAR people that you can't tell that they're by NAR people unless you investigate or know the warning signs. So um, that's a very big concern, I think, in the church too. That's another source. Aside from just the New Age movement and secular culture, that's another source of New Age ideas in the church.
I think that's so good. It's so important, and I can't stress this enough, is as you raise your children, and even if you have a late start, man, get your kids to understand who God is,
Yes,
who
yes,
who the Trinitarian God is, because when you give them those discussions, when you sit around your dinner table, when you're talking about this in your vehicle going to practice, talk to them about who God actually is, because when they're introduced to these false ideas, they will have the truth grounded in them to compare to, because you're right, there is an ocean of competing ideas of what is true, and it is devouring our young people.
yeah. You got to be, and that's good what you suggested. I agree with that. Know who God is from Scripture, because the way they characterize God and Jesus is not biblical. I think actually they're kind of, one of the big things in the NAR is that several of their leaders have claimed they've had trips to heaven, and they've had conversations with Jesus, and they've even done things, like maybe play a baseball game with Jesus or something. It's actually very demeaning to Jesus.
Yes.
and
Yes.
and they'll talk about it in this very casual way. So when you see somebody talking about Jesus like that, that should be a red flag. There's people are not taking trips to heaven.
That's
That
right.
is just not happening. When our life is over, then it's over.
That's
And we
right.
don't we don't we don't just get to go to heaven while we're alive. I mean, even in scripture, I mean, Elijah was taken up
Right.
to heaven, but that was it. I mean, he didn't suddenly appear later. John the Baptist was a type of Elijah, but he was not Elijah in the flesh. You only have one life.
Right.
You live one life. And as far as a lot of people try to use Paul's account, I think in 1 Corinthians 12 or 2 Corinthians 12, I always forget, where he talks about, I think it's 1 Corinthians, he talks
Hmm.
about the third heaven,
Right. Hmm.
and he doesn't say what happened. He says, I don't know if I was in the body or out of the body, but God gave me this thorn in the flesh to keep me humble,
Right.
basically, about it. He can't boast about anything.
Yeah.
And so whatever happened there, we are not privy to it. God has not revealed it to us, and didn't want Paul to talk about it.
Right.
And it didn't have anything to do with a visit to heaven. I think probably he had a vision
Right.
in some way, an encounter with the Lord, just like maybe some of the Old Testament characters did. But that doesn't mean, and none of them went to heaven. They didn't
Right.
have little trips, and they didn't do things that these NAR people are claiming. So these are these kind of grandiose claims. Notice that the focus in the NAR, another thing to look for is the focus is on man. The focus is on man, not on God.
Yes.
It's what you can do, what you're able to do. It's all about you and how you're going to do this or that.
Yes.
Even when they talk about the gospel, it's about how they're going to go out and spread the news to everybody, but they're not really sharing the true gospel of
Right.
Christ. So it's very bad that this is happening in the church now, but it is, and it is a big movement, and it's gaining ground.
Yeah.
So the more that people know about it, the better.
I agree. And if you're listening and you're looking for a church, man, sit down with the pastor, sit down with the leaders of the church that you're looking to bring your family into, because what these leaders and these pastors are preaching, what they believe, needs to be sound. Sit down and
Yes,
talk to them, ask them questions.
yes,
What do you believe about, Bethel? What do you believe about Hillsong? What do you believe about the NAR? What do you believe about, all these kinds of ideas? Because at the end of the day, these are the people that are going to be pouring into your family. But it is your responsibility first at home.
Yeah, 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 to check things out. Yeah, check people
Yes,
out. And when you see warning signs in your church, you need to address them. You have
absolutely.
to address them. So you don't want something like that to take hold. It divides churches. People have to leave
Yeah,
churches. I have two friends, and this NAR movement took over their churches. In each case, each of them had to leave
yeah.
the church they were in. So this is not just something that might happen. It's something that has been happening.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I've taken so much of your time, and that's why I hesitate asking you this question, this last question. But you have done so much work concerning the Enneagram, and it is definitely something that I
Mm.
wanted to bring up for our listeners because you have done so much work on it. Tell us a little bit about what it is. However, take as long as you want, but I want to respect your time. I know it's a big, big, big topic,
Yes,
but
it's a huge topic. I could do a whole program with you on that.
maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll do that
Maybe
on
we'll,
another one, but at least give us a
yeah.
little bit of intro
Okay,
and why it's
sure.
dangerous. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the Enneagram does come from these esoteric, occult, and New Age teachers. It wasn't formed by research or, by a group of psychologists trying to come up with some kind of tool to assess personality. It came straight out of New Age and occult teachings, which I can go into more another time if you want to do that. And it's not valid. It's not valid. It's not a valid tool. First of all, there is no personality test that's valid. None of the popular, including the Myers Briggs, none of them are considered valid. For one thing, personality changes, it doesn't stay the same. Also, the other problem with the fact that it's a false tool, is that it tries to categorize you. And according to these categories, then you're supposed to make decisions, how I should behave or what I should be looking at. Because I'm a 4, then I need to look at this other number here or whatever. And it's putting this whole false thinking in you, because none of this is based on truth. The categories are not distinct enough to be categories. I've been told that by a Christian psychologist. They're just not distinct enough. It's a lot like astrology. It works the same way as astrology. It has categories and descriptions that can apply to most people. So it's artificial. It's not valid. It comes from New Age occult teachings. And the goal of the Enneagram is a spiritual goal. The goal is not to find out your personality. The goal is to find out your false self so that you can uncover your true self. That is how it was taught. That is how it's taught in the New Age. You have a true divine self in the New Age, and this false persona is covering it up. So you discover which of the 9 types you are in order to work on that and uncover and reveal your true self. Um, and as far as Richard Rohr teaching it, and I won't go into him, because if we do the program, I can go into him more, because he's another thing to know about, another person to know about. He is heretical. Richard Rohr's Enneagram book is how the Enneagram got into the church. And he believes that we have always been with God. He's a follower of perennial wisdom. And he believes we've always been with God and have never been separated from God. So he believes the Enneagram is a tool to find this false self and uncover the real self that has never been separated from God. So it's a little bit like the New Age, but yet it's different. And so this is the goal of Enneagram. This is the whole purpose of it. It's not about who you are and trying to determine how to live your life based on that. And then on top of that, the other thing I want to say is that what God cares about is character, not our personality. You can look and
Mm.
see how different people in the Bible, from what we can tell, have these different kinds of temperaments and personalities. I mean, Peter, I think, is shown as being sort of impulsive and maybe a little hot-headed or something, and you can kind of see that. But that didn't matter. God, and Moses didn't want to go do what God wanted him to do either. He said he couldn't speak well.
That's
It
good.
doesn't matter. God still used him. He still used Peter. He still used everybody he wanted to use. And And what really counts is the fact as Christians, we're being shaped in conformed to the image of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And so that is who we look to. That is who we should look at, is how are we being conformed to the image of Christ? Are we yielding to that as God works on us? That should be what we look towards, not I need to be a healthy 7. I need to be, a healthy 3,
Yeah.
or however. This is how a lot of the Enneagram teachers put it. And the other thing is, every Christian Enneagram book out there has false information in it. First of all, the Enneagram is false to begin with, but it gives false information about its history. And it whitewashes a lot of the characters that were involved who are actually occultists, and it will whitewash them or rationalize it in some way. So I've done a lot of work in this area the past several years of my life. A good portion of it has been spent on on exposing the Enneagram and looking at what's coming out for Christians in the church on it, and some of the people who have written those books and some of the Enneagram teachers in the church. I've done a lot of Facebook posts on this. I have 9 articles on my website on the Enneagram, and we have the book, Richard Rohr and the Enneagram Secret, that I wrote with 2 other people. So that will give the history and everything you need to know. But yeah, so it's a false tool. It's a tool with a spiritual purpose that is contrary to Christ, and therefore it is not beneficial or edifying. It's not going to help you in the long run, and it may actually cause damage. So it's a definite no on the Enneagram from me. Definite. There's absolutely nothing good about it. Not a single. I could say that about astrology. There's nothing good about astrology. There's nothing good about the Enneagram.
Excellent. Thank you so much. There's, like you said, there's so much we want to kind of uncover on that, but definitely we'll have to have you back so we can dig a little bit deeper on that treasure trove of wisdom that you have on that subject. But thank you so much, Marcia. I just so appreciated this conversation. It's helpful to me as a parent, helpful to me as a minister of the gospel. And I certainly hope that it's going to be helpful to other parents as they listen, and grandparents, because that is one group that I'm constantly hearing from, is just the generational gap there. They love their grandchildren, but they see that they are having trouble even communicating with them. And so for our listeners, we will have all of these links posted in the description. Please, please, please make yourselves welcome to these tools, these resources. Purchase Marcia's books that are going to be definitely helpful for you as you raise your teens and deal with these cultural topics and information that's definitely going to be affecting them today.
Okay, thank you for having me.